Today I'm going to be discussing a book which is called Man's Search for Meaning. It was written by a psychologist named Viktor Frankl. The story behind Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning resides around the very life that which Viktor Frankl experienced as a captive in Auschwitz during World War II. As a psychologist, he began to see now that under different life conditions, humans take on different, not necessarily responsibilities, but predicaments known as traumas, which lead to their responsibilities they take on upon themselves. That was the observation he made. But let's dive into a story which I'm going to explain, and then we're going to dive into the meaning behind that particular story. Now, in Auschwitz, obviously, we've heard of the human experimenting through gas chambers and so forth. But in Auschwitz, they didn't just test the very things that can affect humans, they tested everything that can affect humans. And it is a rather dark study because it is not just a physical effect that they studied, but also the effect on the minds of those that were present within Auschwitz. And once you see the psychology develop, you then begin to see the meaning behind the actions of people. Upon entering Auschwitz, which were where the Jews were sent to, in Auschwitz there was a man at the very front gate, which once you were offloaded off the train, you would line up. And there was a man that would go left or right the moment you presented yourself in front of him. And surely enough, Viktor Frankl speaks about that particular man, before you even got to Auschwitz, which the train ride itself was of pure torment because you knew what your fate was going to be. They had already heard about the monstrosities that occurred in Auschwitz, and if you were captured and brought by train to Auschwitz, you already know and knew that you were going to be doomed. But here's this man, which you arrived to before. If he points that way, you get to live and work in Auschwitz. If he points that way, you're immediately sent to die in the gas chamber because you are not seen as a fit person to work. And as the story continues, if you were pointed that way, which Viktor Frankl was, you begin to work in Auschwitz as a laborer, doing the duties that which the higher-ups are studying. If you were not able to, through the gruesome regime that which you were given in order to work, which was minimal clothing, minimal nutrition, and maximum effort required out of you every single day. The moment you now see that you either acquire an injury or are simply unwell because you're not fed and are malnourished, the moment you collapse, and basically the moment you can no longer move forward as a person, you were sent to die if you could no longer work. And as you see this progression, the more you worked, the more you were given and rewarded with more responsibility. And the more you worked and were given more responsibility, the tougher the decisions you were faced in making in order to assure your survival. So much so that if you worked enough and acquired higher ranks of those that dictate and tell you you are now this or that, in the observation of the conditions of life, it got to a point where the people in Auschwitz became so comfortable in minimal conditions of life. To a certain degree, we as humans adapt to our environment and we find comfort in our environment. And if we reduce the potential of our environment, we become comfortable or accustomed to that particular state. Now, to what degree are we talking about? In Auschwitz, every day, you could be having breakfast and it would be seen as normal and no longer triggering for a person to be eating breakfast while a person was being dragged down the stairs because they were dead and you could hear their skull bounce off of every step. And this was a normal condition for the people that suffered in the human experiments of Auschwitz. Now let's advance into the story. I'm not going to reveal the full story, but I want to make a particular point. Do you remember in part of the story that I was explaining that upon getting off the train, you were greeted by a man which pointed this way or pointed that way? In Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he discusses that no matter the conditions of life you were given and no matter the suffering you suffered, it meant you had to take on more responsibility the more suffering you could endure. The more suffering one could endure, you took on more responsibility. Now that was the responsibility as a prisoner to become the man that dictates who lives and who goes to suffer and suffer more and suffer more. Because if that man himself did not make that very conscious decision, and if he did his job wrong, he himself would be sent to die a horrible death. In that particular notion of the psychology, the study that I've come to understand out of this particular thing is the human nature. In that very story, you can see a very particular thing about human nature, which is humans do what they can to survive, even if it means punishing someone else the same way that they were punished. And even in the goodness of their heart, there still is a responsibility that once you take on a higher responsibility as a result of your suffering, you now are given more suffering the more responsibility you take upon yourself. Because the transition from physical suffering then become the responsibility of the decision making of mental suffering. It is one thing if you're the person that goes to suffer as a result of someone else's decision. But very well did that man know that if he did not choose carefully based on his observation of the people before him that would line up in train carts of trains full of people every day. Every day that man had to make the decisions, which he himself was once a person that was brought upon this train. And if he did not choose carefully as to say, this person is deemable to be a worker, to go and suffer, or this person, they're not fit for work, and so I send you to die immediately. If not, I personally die. Do you see the darkness of this particular human experiment, which exploits the psychology of humans, which is our human nature? The more suffering we take on, the more responsibility we take on, but the more responsibility we take on, the more suffering we endure in our own selves. Where do we win as humans? If you were to now look at the purpose behind the experiments of Auschwitz, Hitler essentially wanted to create what was known as the Aryan race, a perfect race of human. He wanted to create an evolution of human beings, a race, you could say, which were not just of a specific appearance, even though he wanted blue-haired or blonde-haired, blue-eyed folk to be the Aryan race. He also wanted the Aryan race to be of a particular mindset. And as this experiment pursues, the more suffering you take upon yourself, the more responsibility you take upon yourself, and the more suffering you take upon yourself, the more responsibility. And this process became a grandiosity. It was a grandiose experiment to see essentially if Christ himself suffered, would he condemn another soul to suffer? And the beauty of it all, Hitler basically wanted to prove, is God wrong? That is the nature of humans, wanting to prove that its creator was wrong. It is the act of the Satan, if you wish. In the book of Job is written the story of a man, a biblical story, which is a man that once had everything. And because of an accuser known as the Satan, which is what the term Satan derives from. It took me 3 years of Latin to learn that one. Now, aside from the humor, what is the condition of humans? What is life? What do you think causes you to learn as a person? Would you not say that to a certain degree as a human, if you as a person do not suffer or are faced with a consequence, you do not get to see where you can go towards the right direction? And the more you suffer, the more you become of a good nature, good-hearted, more willing to prevent the suffering of another, until it gets to the point where now it is up to you, where you have to say, I either choose to continue suffering, or now I inflict the suffering on someone else in order to assure my survival. and it creates a pathology. It creates a psychopath, essentially, which was the mindset that Hitler wanted the Aryan race to be based around, which was of a superior mentality, superior physicality, and ultimately a superior spirit. It is a darkness. When you ask God, as an example, here's a question most people wish they could ask God. God, why is it that there is evil in the world? And I would say that God's answer to that would be, if it weren't for the darkness, there would be no light. If you cannot differentiate good from evil, how would you know what's what? How would you know a morality in your life if you were not faced with a suffering that dictated your ability to say, this is right and this is wrong? In order to learn the differentiation as a human, you need to basically learn what it means to suffer in order to get away from the suffering. And if for that man, for any man, and for any woman, the more responsibility you take upon yourself, the more you suffer as a result of taking that responsibility. And the more you take on a responsibility, the more you suffer. To the point now you're now faced with a choice. Do you send those to die, or do you send those to live and suffer just as you have, so that they themselves may take on your place once you're seen as no longer fit for work? I would like to point out a certain thought that just came to mind throughout the video, which I invite you to watch again. Do you see the divide from light to darkness in the space that I am in? In that particular space, you might see me pace back and forth. At which point do you see the train of thought go towards a darkness, and at which point do you see the train of thought I'm speaking go towards the light? Which ultimately now dictates the true battle between evil and good. That battle is not fought by armies, it is not fought by kingdoms, but the battle between good and evil is the battle of the conscience of a human, of a aware person, where now you see that every thought, every word, every action, every pattern, every habit becomes life. If you wish to change your life, you need to change your habits, your patterns, your actions, your words, and your thoughts. Because if you cannot change your thoughts and your approach that you project out into the world based on your thinking, how do you expect your life to change if in your own mind you are unable to create a change in your way of thinking? Do you now see that from every thought and for every word, you begin a constant pendulum between good and evil? You could be speaking one sentence, and there is a resonance in your sentence that causes you to swing as a pendulum between both of these particular forces, every action becomes a pendulum swing towards one polarity of good or evil. Every particular thing you do now becomes where you find the battle, to the point that if you reach an equilibrium or a standpoint, you're half evil and half good. But to what extent does that mean in your judgment of life, where now the angel Michael places your soul upon a scale, where if the scale and the weight of your soul tips in the favor of yourself for the goodness you have done, you get to enter heaven. Whereas if your soul is lighter, you get to enter heaven. But if your soul is heavier, you are sent to hell. The point I'm trying to get to is, as a human, you cannot live your life entirely good or entirely bad. You have to be both at the same time. Because we are just human. That is our experience. And if you live too purely, all it takes is one particular person can set you off based on the amount of suffering you have taken upon yourself. In the goodness of your heart, one particular sin towards you could become what tipped the scales based on the moment you die, in which direction you pendulum swings at the moment of your death. Every action, every word, all of a sudden creates a tipping point upon that scale. And the moment you die, do you choose to die committing evil or committing good? Because it could be that one particular decision that tips the scale in your favor.